At the Julian Way, we empower individuals with disabilities to thrive in faith communities by breaking barriers and fostering belonging. Your support helps us create accessible spaces where everyone feels valued and seen. Join us in making a difference today at www.thejulianway.org. Together, we can build communities of belonging.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Palsies with Palsies. I am your palsy, Bekah Maren Anderson.
And I am your palsy, Dillon Hargrave.
We have a different palsy today. Hi, Dillon.
Hey, Bekah, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome being the co-host today, as we are both aware Justin is enjoying some vacation time right now, and
Yeah.
as a result, and us very much wanting to get an episode of the podcast up on schedule, I
hmm
have been invited to join you today, which I'm looking forward to. And yeah, it's still nonetheless big shoes to fill.
I hear that, but you do in fact have big shoes of your own. So I'm just so glad to have you here today. Because we have some really interesting stuff to talk about. You and I, we always have interesting conversations, but I went to Dillon earlier in the week and said, Justin isn't here, help. Um, and Dillon pitched a really compelling topic to discuss. You want to share what that is, Dillon?
Yeah, sure. It's we're recording this on July 9th. I believe this episode will come out tomorrow on the 10th. Um,
Mm-hmm.
don't judge us for our recording and editing practices. Sometimes we get things done last minute, not all the time. But nonetheless, it's what I would say in the heart of Disability Pride Month,
Mm-hmm.
on the heels of uh, Pride Month or Queer Pride Month or however you want to define it, but the
Mm-hmm.
what I would say is the more universally known Pride Month. And we have not on the podcast discussed either of these things recently, at the very least, and I felt like it
Mm-hmm.
was a good opportunity to bring it up, particularly um, because of some uh, new stages I've achieved in my journey, and I don't want to dive too deep in the deep end yet, but that's what my pitch was.
Yeah, absolutely, and yeah, I think we also as we started talking about it, and we'll get into it more about how pride can be complicated. Like it can be a beautiful thing, and in some of us, queer pride, disability pride, all of these things can also awaken these feelings of imposter syndrome. Just like Dylan was talking about with filling Justin's shoes. It can be a complicated time to have one of these particular identities, and I know when you mentioned that, Dylan, I was like, that's a feeling that I have felt. That's a feeling that I have heard lots of other people talking about. That's a feeling that probably a number of people listening to the show are having right now. Thinking about, how do I relate to disability pride or LGBTQ pride? Um, so I guess maybe where I'd love to start with this is what does pride mean to you when whether we're thinking LGBTQ pride or disability pride, like when you hear that term, what does it kind of uh, resonate for you? What does it bring up?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Becca. And I'm taking a little time to consider it because the
Mm-hmm.
first thing that pops up is actually the word proud, which
Mm.
I can be blamed for getting caught in linguistic minutia, but I was raised in an environment in a community where being prideful or being proud um, was often seen as a negative thing, uh,
Mm.
and I think that does complicate what we think about when we talk about pride as what we, I think, in this context, universally agree is a good thing.
Hmm.
And so for me, when I think of uh, pride specifically in the context of this conversation for myself, disability pride, it means to really own and have the experience of integrating your identity as a disabled person into your holistic identity and honoring that both internally and externally, whether that's how you walk through your day-to-day life, and up to including how you interact with others personally and professionally.
Hmm.
In a
Yeah.
nutshell.
Yeah. No,
What
I would agree with that, and I would also echo that sense of like I think it maybe wasn't like a focus in my family or community, but I do feel like I kind of grew up with this sense of like being as you say, prideful, being too proud. Like proud almost always came with the modifier "to" before it. That you don't want to take up too much space, you don't want to be boasting. um like pride is one of the seven deadly sins. Like not that that's a thing that my community really followed, but like also I think some of that does get baked into certain cultures. You're just not, you just need to watch your sense of pride and be suspicious of it. But yeah, I think the so much of what feels important to me about queer pride and disability pride and pride in any sort of marginalized identity is that these are things that society told us not to be proud of, not just because like don't be prideful, but because these are things that actually you should be ashamed of. Right? That there's all of this queer phobia that says, if you are queer, you should be ashamed of it. If you are disabled, you should be ashamed of it, or minimize it, or try to make it as little uh, as least impactful on society as you can. And pride is saying, no, I'm I'm going to be this as much as I am. It is as you say, it's part of me, it's part of the whole of me, and I will recognize that to myself, and I will show that to other people as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that. And I will say that what comes up in immediate response is actually part of a comedy bit I heard recently. I went to a local
Mm.
comedy show, supporting some friends of mine who are also comedians, who I genuinely enjoy their stand-up. But in a nutshell, not to steal anybody's jokes or to give away anything if you might see
Hmm.
these people perform, uh, one of the comics um, said that they had recently become single and they decided that they only want to date men if they're at least a little bit gay. And the argument was that the biggest problem with straight men that they had dated was that their biggest issue was their fear of somebody thinking that they were gay. And I think
Mm.
that what you're describing is, you know, just integrating your own identity to the point to where you're not afraid of somebody calling you out for something that you're not,
Yeah.
particularly because we live in a larger context where whether or not, owning your queer identity or your identity as a disabled person is seen as a benefit or a deficit in a sense.
Hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. Like when when we live in a society where calling a man gay is still read as an insult, used as an insult in many contexts, and when you know terms for disability are still insults, lame and cripple and crazy, like these are things that we have to be kind of loud sometimes about claiming to say, like, I'm not going to be ashamed of this, and no one else should be either, and no one should be afraid of having that identity, because that's also like, I also think, when I think about you know uh, straight men being afraid of being perceived as gay, I also think about how many people that's probably stopping from exploring their sexuality. Like, I think hot take, not very hot in many places. I think a lot of people are a lot more queer than uh, they will necessarily let on, and it's because it's not always safe to explore that. It's not always something that feels possible, and I would really love to see a world where it is possible for, both for a man to be like, someone to call him gay and him to be like, no, that's not me, or for someone to call him gay and him to be like, that's maybe a little bit me, and all of those answers are fine.
Yeah, I agree. And I will just, add as an asterisk because I don't think it's worth telling the whole story, but I actually was in the last week, on the same timeline as hearing that joke, um, heard the word gay being used as an insult towards me. So
Mm,
I uh,
mm,
I um I know that that's still a thing. Certainly didn't affect me.
yeah.
But I also, to widen the scope to include our topic today, I think that's also very true with people's identities of disability.
Mm,
I think that so many people are probably dealing with real constraints, physical constraints, mental constraints, emotional constraints, that aren't exploring those in a way that allows them to integrate them, to heal as much as they can, to improve their lives and the lives of others that they engage with, um, because of that fear that they will be labeled as a disabled person.
yeah.
And I know that, just to get real specific with my story and my journey, um, I was born with my disability. To say that I was unaware of my identity as a disabled person at any point in time in my life would be false. And I can honestly sit here and say that um, for a majority of my life, it was not something that I considered or featured, and I very much was conditioned and lived in a lifestyle where I would say that I was mainstream to the point to where I just assumed that some people recognized that I had a disability and some people didn't. Most of the people
Hmm.
who've been around me the longest and have seen my transformation since I've picked up cycling as a profession will name that I much less visibly disabled than I was, which I actually appreciate because that does make me feel seen more than the people who say, "Well, I would have never thought you had a disability." But
Uh-huh.
even up until when I came to the Julian way, and in fact, it was my relationship with Justin that really invited me to integrate that part of my identity into my um, holistic identity of self. Uh, because I was going through a season of my career where disability was a topic in meeting rooms, and I didn't
Hmm.
really know what that meant to me. And I still remember whenever I first met Justin and we were kind of getting into some of these details, Googling
Hmm.
right hemiparesis and is this cerebral palsy? Because I
Mm,
was already dealing with even then this identity crisis or this imposter syndrome is the term that we are kind of featuring today around. Okay, yes, I have this same categorically similar condition as Justin, although our lived experiences are very different. And that
hmm.
comparison, which I think is a big challenge um, to do to compare anything really, but to particularly to compare people and people's lived experiences is part of
Hmm.
where things get sticky, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and you can tell me if this is off base, but I think imposter syndrome often has two sides in these sorts of situations. I think where like one side is disability is stigmatized. We're trying to avoid the stigma, right? You know, and there's the like the societal pressure to appear as non-disabled as possible. But then the other side is the like, well, you know, there's this disability community thing over here, and these, you know, this talk about accessibility and you know, making space to support our bodies and our minds exactly as they are. And am I disabled enough to be part of that? Am I taking away something from somebody else if I take up space in that community? And I think that's a lot of where the comparison comes in, right? Is like, you know, you looking at Justin, you'd be like, well, yeah, of course Justin's got cerebral palsy, of course Justin's disabled. But then like looking at yourself, it's like, well, here's all of the ways in which I'm not like Justin, even if there are also many ways in which you are.
Yeah, I think that you are on base with that, and you, I'm curious to ask you, you know, how does that show up in queer spaces? And
Mm-hmm.
is, you know, I imagine there's a version of am I queer enough to attend this, you know, event or this
Oh
uh,
yeah.
you know, parade or whatever the case may be. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'm curious as how that as someone who believes that there in a lot of ways that the queer community is a couple steps ahead of the disability community with organizing and integrating, and I may be wrong about that, but I'm curious as to how that's been addressed in your experience or in your observation.
Yeah, no, I definitely had a lot of imposter syndrome around my queer identity for a long time. Um, and a lot of that for me had to do with aesthetics. It felt like there were particular ways in which queer people like visually and outwardly expressed their queerness, right? You know, and so like particularly thinking about myself as someone assigned female at birth, it's like, okay, so like, you know, queer women or you know, AFAB folks, you know, dress more butch and cut their hair short and, you know, dye their hair exciting colors and, you know, and all of these things. And I was like, much of that is just not my style. There's a whole other topic here about what my style is and my complicated relationship with clothes and aesthetics. But I knew pretty early on, like I just, you know, I'm a very, I would like to think about my appearance as little as possible is kind of my goal in life. Um, and so making any sort of deliberate aesthetic choice around that felt very challenging. Um, and then, you know, there's the fact that like my queerness kind of crept up on me slowly. I would say. I also describe it as I get queerer and queerer the longer I live, which I find very exciting. But you know, that meant that like when I was in high school and first you know, figuring these things out, um, I was describing my sexuality as heteroflexible, which basically means mostly straight, but you know, open to being flexible. Um, and that felt true at the time. I felt like most of my attraction was to men, but you know, also definitely some to people who weren't men. And so then there was that sense of like, well, is that enough? Like, you know, if I'm identifying as mostly straight and I enter these queer spaces or I go to Pride or I wear rainbows, like, you know, am I making a safe space less safe because I'm here identifying largely as a straight person, and like, and it was very strange because it was one of those like I feel like sometimes you can tell that it's imposter syndrome rather than, you know, just, oh yeah, no, this isn't my identity, because you want to be in the space. Right? Like I kept being like, if I'm identifying mostly as straight, why do I want to be in these queer spaces? And it's like, well, possibly because I'm queer. You know, that's that's maybe sometimes the simplest answer is the best one. Um, but yeah, I mean, it is complicated because I like the best queer spaces will not, you know, have any sort of legitimacy tests, right? You know, the best of queer spaces are going to trust that anyone who shows up and says that they're queer is queer, and anyone who shows up and doesn't say anything is either queer or an ally. And like, you know, until you are a jerk and prove yourself not to be safe, like, you know, you'll be welcomed. But there are also definitely spaces where, you know, you hear people talking about like, oh, there's all of these bisexual girls who aren't really bisexual. They're just straight, and they're just pretending to be bi because it's trendy, and like, and you hear that, and you know, as I would hear that as you know, someone who was identifying as a somewhat bisexual woman, and be like, is that me? Am I pretending? Do people think I'm pretending if I go in these spaces? Like, is somebody going to tell me that this identity that feels still very new and very tender is somebody actually going to tell me that it's not real? And that's a very uncomfortable and yeah, tender place to be.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I just want to take a minute, a beat, if you will, to elevate something you said, because I think that, more people need to hear this. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that is, you can tell it's authentic if you want to be in the space.
Mm-hmm.
Want to, if you genuinely, I would maybe modify that at least in stop me if I'm out of line here, to say,
Mm-hmm.
if you genuinely want to belong to a
Yeah.
community or to an event or to a gathering or to an identity stated, and you maintain that at least the baseline curiosity of what that means for yourself, then
Mm-hmm.
chances are you are taking up the space that you need to take up by being there.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, and to bring it back to the disability space, like I do spend so much of my time, you know, telling folks with various sorts of limitations and embodied experiences, like you can be in disability spaces if you want to, and you know, like we're not, again, the best of disability spaces are not going to put any sort of legitimacy tests on anyone. And yeah, like I really do believe that, you know, disability is and queerness, frankly, like, you know, just because like there are, it is becoming more societally acceptable to be queer, right, in some circles, and just because, you know, there are spaces where disability is more recognized and celebrated, doesn't mean that those are categories that people who do not actually have an experience of that are like knocking on the door clamoring to be part of. Like, I think like if people are feeling like a draw to disability community, or feeling a resonance with experiences of disabled people, are feeling that they would benefit from some of the access tools or practices that are getting talked about, it's probably because you're one of us.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, to to push back a little bit, or maybe to invite some friction in the conversation, because ultimately
Mm-hmm.
I think these things are easy, particularly for me and you to talk about because of the spaces we occupy together and the conversations and the
Yeah.
relationship that we've built through those conversations. Um, and it's I want to bring up, a part of my story that I think I hope has value to the listeners.
Hmm.
And that is, it was easy for me to join the Julian Way community. It was easy. It's been relatively easy for me to espouse the anti-ableism training, to explore my own internalized ableism, to advocate for universal spaces. Um,
Hmm.
Things became much more difficult for me whenever I decided to seek my Paralympic bid. And
Mm.
specifically that, and this is, kind of goes back to a conversation we had in a previous episode, but it relates a lot, I think, to the idea of classification.
Hmm.
Because within the para athletic community, yes, everybody's disabled. Yes, everybody, it's an extremely welcoming community. And in order to compete, you must be classified, and therefore there has to be more stringent definitions of your specific constraints and how they affect your embodiment.
Yeah.
And that creates a little bit of, I would say, actually, a little bit, maybe an understatement. I would say that creates a sense of comparison that's probably more internal than it is
Hmm.
external. Although I will admit that, when you line up for a race, you start to wonder, how if you're in the right category, if these people are as disabled as you are, if you're more disabled than them, what has their
Hmm.
journey been like to get here compared to mine? It's also allowed me to, as a good thing, I will say it allowed me to integrate the TBI community, or the traumatic brain injury community, into what I would call as my people. And I'm
Mm.
saying that as a way to, I guess, introduce that I have for a long time said palsy people are my people. I have lots of
Hmm.
friends with cerebral palsy, and I feel like we really resonate with each other's experiences. And I've learned that
Hmm.
people who have had later in life traumatic brain injuries also have very similar lived experiences.
Mm.
But to get more specific to this idea of classification and this legitimacy test, I think is what you called it. Um,
Hmm.
I recently received a co-sponsorship from the Tulsa Cerebral Palsy Association, and I
Hmm.
will admit that I had not considered reaching out to them. Um, it was through a friend of mine whose father has a connection with the organization, that I was invited to apply for a grant that they offered. Um,
Hmm.
and they very eagerly supported me in that grant without really asking me to legitimize myself, any
Hmm.
more than in a simple questionnaire, and a framework. However, when I went to go pick up that check, and I was talking to the woman whose daughter has cerebral palsy, and meeting her family, I felt internally, and I'm not blaming this on anybody else in the room except for myself, that I needed to prove that I was actually they actually have cerebral palsy,
Hmm.
and that imposter syndrome started to creep in about, okay, well, am I effectively representing the community by, taking up this co-sponsorship with the Tulsa Cerebral Palsy Association? Um,
Hmm.
and that's something that, I just want to name to give it light for the conversation, and hopefully, um, other people will hear that as a way to um, accept that these things do come with ongoing challenges the more you integrate those identities. And yeah, I'm just curious as to, uh, in your journey, when you maybe stopped feeling like there had to be a certainty for you to, more closely identify and integrate with the queer community.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I'll first pause just to say, just to you know, validate that experience, and you know, and also you to say that, you know, I think it's amazing that you have this sponsorship, and I think you will represent this Tulsa cerebral palsy group very well. But also that I hear that like there is this distinct sort of pressure on imposter syndrome when you are representing your community, that like, you know, even if you have felt comfortable to enter that community, then to say like, I'm going to go out into the world saying like, I am this group's representative in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, that gets into a really interesting space. I think in terms of my you know, journey with my queer identity and imposter syndrome, just being in the more queer spaces I was in that were truly welcoming, the better it got. The more queer I started to feel, the better it got. And you know, and you can, I think there's multiple ways to read that sense of feeling more queer, right? Like, you know, some of that may be, you know, sexuality can change over time. Some of that may be the more time I spent in the queer community, the more I was able to open up to these other parts of myself that maybe I just hadn't been as aware of or willing to look at very much. But yeah, I mean, I think there is still sometimes this anxiety of, you know, like going back to appearance of like, okay, you know, I want to show up in this particular space as a queer person, and often it's like I want to communicate to non-queer people that I am here as a queer person. Like that feels important as part of. I think about this a lot when I'm preaching or when I'm presenting, and I'm talking about theology from the margins, and I'm talking about social justice, and I want it. I do want to be clear that, you know, my identity as a queer and a disabled person is key to the work that I do. And due to the nature of my disability, that one's pretty visually obvious, and will often come up in discussions of my work. And I can mention queerness does sometimes come up in my presentations, but it's just based on the work I'm doing right now, it's rarely the focus. And I've noticed people will miss it. Like, you can say you're queer like 3 times in a sermon and then like mention it to someone in conversation later, and they'll be like, oh wait, really? I never would have known. And it's like, I said it. I fully said it. And that happens to me, I think, because I don't think most people read me as queer most of the time. And that, you know, unless I'm literally wearing a shirt that says I'm gay, which I do sometimes. And that does still bother me. Like it doesn't necessarily give me the sense of like I'm maybe I'm not queer enough, but it does give me a sense of like I it is important to me to present as fully myself as I can at pretty much every given moment. And so I would, in a lot of circumstances, I would really like to be legible as queer. And you know, that part of why I got my undercut a few weeks ago, that I'm not sure is actually communicating that to a lot of people, but it does to me, and that, you know, so that helps. But yeah, but then also remembering that like there are spaces in which I maybe don't want to be legibly queer. You know, I am lucky enough to move in very safe spaces, But at the same time, if I'm just doing a random pulpit supply gig on a given Sunday with a church I don't know, maybe I don't want my sexuality and my queerness to be a main topic of conversation or thought or speculation. Like, the question of, like, which of my identities am I demonstrating to the world still feels very fraught in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm taking it all in because I think one thing that we have in common in our journeys in kind of a parallel is that um at least a belief in our ability to choose,
Mm,
how much we present. I can certainly resonate with, you know, many people with varying degrees of connection to my life who I may have told on multiple occasions that I'm disabled, but will
hmm.
still do not see me as disabled.
Yeah.
And um by and large, any room I walk into, um, you know, unless I'm doing a lot of physical activity, I can remain anonymous in that sense. Uh,
Hmm.
and I do think there's part of my version of imposter syndrome, at least, is an awareness that not everybody gets to choose to hide it.
Yeah.
Um, I think that there's probably a version of that within the queer community as well, particularly
Hmm.
for people who are living authentically in a community that may not be safe for them.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that brings up a really important point that we talked about a little bit in the beginning about how, you know, being a part of a marginalized community is by definition marginalized because these identifying factors either have been used, are being used, or potentially could be used to dehumanize us.
Yes.
And that is something that I would start by saying takes a tremendous amount of courage to identify as any kind of marginalized community authentically, um, particularly in spaces that aren't um, universally recognized as safe spaces, which I think is increasingly more spaces than less spaces, unfortunately, in our um,
Yeah.
current climate. Uh,
Hmm.
and uh, I think that it also brings up the point to say and to just acknowledge that um, the those sometimes come with real risks, and the
Hmm.
reality is not everybody universally has the same ability to blend in a sense. Does that make am I resonating with you in anything that I'm saying?
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, there is privilege in being able to pass, basically. Being able to pass as non-disabled, being able to pass as straight and cis. There's privilege and there's pain, but yeah, like, people who do not have that choice um, are living a very different and sometimes a less safe experience. That, like, for all the, I am not ashamed of my blindness. I have a lot of pride in my blindness. There are times where I do wish I could make the choice to hide it because people are being assholes. And it would be nice in some circumstances to be able to pass in the way that I know some people with more vision than I can. That being said, I also think a lot these days about how unsafe it is for so many people to be readable, to be legible as queer or trans or disabled. And in many ways, that makes me want to be even more legible and visible, to take some of the heat. That, like, this is the sort of time where, as you say, like, there are more and more spaces that are less and less safe. And there are people who are going to be unsafe no matter what. And then there are some of us who get to choose. And to the extent that I can, in a lot of circumstances, I would like to choose to be visible in order to say, look, there are more of us than you think. And, if I can take some attention away from somebody else who didn't get to choose to be readable in the same way that I did, then that is that is a choice that I would like to make. And again, like, this is one of those, I think all choices are valid here. Like, if people are, judging the risks and determining that what they really need to do is to pass, to be read as straight, as cis, as non-disabled as best they can, absolutely no shame to that. I want everyone to be safe. And for myself, I have enough privilege that if I can take some risks, I would like to.
Yeah, I agree. Um, I think choose visibility, you know, resonates with me as a particularly um, strong slogan. I think
Mm,
these characters like the two of us, uh,
mm-hmm,
and I also agree that all choices are valid. Um, I'll admit, as somebody who has grown up and lived my entire life at a lot of different intersections. Of a ambiguously brown skin, just to name it, and
mm-hmm,
curiously white hair, to also name it. But so depending on what space I'm in, I've felt a lot of choice and have had to um, you know, think a lot about how visible I want to be in different situations. And I think
mm-hmm,
that, as I'm considering it in the context of this conversation, one thing I've learned through my leadership training is to ask the question, who is being centered in this conversation? Who
mm,
who is at the center, the focus point of what the idealized outcomes are, in terms of
yeah,
the various stakeholders in any decision in any community. And I think
mm-hmm,
that the visibility piece for me, and this is kind of a hot take, at least for myself, um, is to say, does my visibility as somebody who is or isn't part of the centered community or group um,
mm-hmm,
change the impact of the discussion in a meaningful way? Do,
yes,
do I identify, say, hey,
mm-hmm,
I considered, how this might affect the accessibility for disabled people? Do I identify, how this may affect, various minority groups? And
mm-hmm,
and I think that range of choices is authentic, is in my experience is a what I would call a moving target.
yes, yeah. No, I think, because that is a very good question to think about. What is the impact on the conversation? What is the impact on the most marginalized people in the space, and how we each show up in that space affect that? Because yeah, there are some spaces where if I am being read as straight and talking about LGBTQ inclusion, I will be taken more seriously. Right? Like, there are some conversations in some spaces where, like, people are just gonna talk over the people that they think are queer, but they will not talk over me in the same way if they think I'm straight. And I know there are situations where that's true for disability, and I know that people who get read as white will sometimes be heard more than people who are not. And it's one of those things that it is evidence itself of prejudice and discrimination, and those of us who occupy these middle categories in some ways can use that not just to our advantage, but to the advantage of the communities that we are part of, and communities that we're not part of, the to folks who are more marginalized than we are.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that there's also something important that needs to be said about if you are in a conversation that excludes you from a group um, that you identify with, um,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't take anything away from your identity in that group. It's
Yes,
just because you've
exactly.
been perceived as not being a part of that group, regardless of how much work you may have done in your own internal journey to integrate that identity into yourself. Don't let that take away from who you are. And I think that
Yeah.
oftentimes, in my experience specifically, I've had to fight that knee-jerk reaction to jump up and say, wait, me too. I'm
Mm-hmm.
also that thing, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
part of who I identify with because often what I've had to accept is that I'm doing that more to feel safe in myself, and it doesn't really help
Mm.
the conversation or the community in that specific context or at that time. And so I
Yeah.
do think that that's also part of that journey of integrating these identities and having that pride, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it's really something that um you've let go of certainty around, but you identify with it enough to carry it with you on a daily basis. Um, you can have more pride in it without feeling that knee-jerk reaction to always, kind of pull the tag along card, I think. And that
Yeah.
may just be me, but I do think that there's probably other people who might be listening to this that could identify with that experience.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I do sometimes, I mentioned my own desire to be perceived as with all of my identities in almost every space that I'm in, and I do sometimes have to examine that impulse, because how much of that is I like being authentically myself. I like and appreciate when other people perceive that, and how much of that is I am looking for other people to validate my identity. I am
Yes.
looking for other people to confirm, yes, you are queer, yes, you are disabled. And that the first set of desires is valid, is makes a lot of sense, and not everyone has them, but for those of us that do, that is totally fine. And the second set of things, of wanting to someone else to validate my identity for me, I don't actually need people to. My identity is valid whether people are perceiving it or not. And yeah, I think if we have one message for everyone listening right now, I think it would be that you are exactly who you are, even if you're not, even if some of those categories are feeling nebulous, even if you're not exactly sure how to define your relationship to those categories, and even if people are telling you that you are not, or just aren't perceiving you as such, you are who you are, and you don't need anybody else to give you a pass that says you're disabled enough to ride, you're queer enough to ride.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as I was preparing for this conversation, I was considering, times when I have confused being uncomfortable with, um, a sense of belonging.
Mm,
And uh, and I think this goes back to your original question about pride as well, because that needing external validation, which I often think is a feature uh, of prideful behavior, maybe.
mm,
Things that, and I'm probably, talking a little bit outside of my own um, knowledge here, but maybe that may be one of the features that put pride on the seven deadly sins list. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that, when you authentically feel like you belong to a community, um, that that need to seek external validation, um, kind of gets absorbed into a more authentic sense of what we mean by pride when we say it in these contexts. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. It's not pride in the sense of I want everyone to recognize this and pat me on the back, applaud me. It's pride in the sense of this is who I am. I am I am proud of it. I am not ashamed, and I think the kind of agency that we've been talking about feels very much part of it too. I have the agency to choose who gets to know about this, and sometimes that's everybody, and sometimes that's just the people that can be trusted because it's not safe. And but yeah, that internal sense of this is my truth without needing other people to necessarily agree with or validate that truth. Well, Dylan, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so glad that you came to me or that you pitched this idea to me. As we prepare to land the plane, any final thoughts? Anything else that you'd like our listeners to keep in mind as they're celebrating Pride or considering Pride? Um, what would you like? What else would you like people to be thinking about coming off of Queer Pride and in the midst of Disability Pride Month?
That's a good question. And I think as a final statement, I would just say that sometimes imposter syndrome isn't evidence that we don't belong. It's evidence
Mm-hmm.
that we crossed into a space where we care deeply about doing right by the people around us.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that that care is where the focus should be. Because
Mm-hmm.
if there's one thing that I think we can always use more of, it's a deep sense of caring for those around us in every space that we're in. And I
Yeah.
encourage everybody listening to this to find a community where you care deeply about the people around you. And I encourage you to enter those spaces courageously. Um, and I thank everybody for listening and thank you for joining me in this conversation, Becca. Is there anything that you would
Yeah.
like to say before I do the outro?
Yeah. I'll give just a this has been a conversation primarily for people within communities or having imposter syndrome about whether you are in a community. And I'll just take a brief moment to speak to allies. If you know that you do not identify with a particular community, but you still care deeply about it and care about the people who are part of it. First of all, thank you, and second of all, I just really want to invite you to celebrate Pride with us. Maybe if you're close to somebody who's LGBTQ or disabled, maybe talk to them about how they would like to celebrate Pride, so that you're centering the way that they experience Pride. But it really is such a beautiful thing when someone is able to say, "This is who I am, and I'm not ashamed of it." And as much as we don't need the external validation, it also really matters when the people around us are able to celebrate with us. So I hope that everyone listening can go out and find somebody to celebrate with, to celebrate all of us being exactly who we are and not being ashamed of it.
I agree 100%. And I will say that this is the Palsies with Palsies podcast. Thank you for listening. Uh, please share it. Um, Leave a review, give us 4 stars, and you can email us at pwp@thejulianway.org and find
Mhm.
us where all podcasts can be found. See you next week. This is my first time to do the outro. Did I miss anything? See you
You
in
did
two
great.
weeks.
You did great. Go out and put some good into the world, friends. Thanks,
Bye.
Dylan. Thanks, everyone.